All right, welcome to the February AMA episode on the Inner Fire Climbing Podcast. I am your host, Jesse Firestone. This will just be me in this episode. I think in the future I'm going to try to have guests on for the AMAs, just kind of depending on what questions I get. But this will just be me going through these, and I'm probably not going to make it through in one session, so expect some audio blips here and there as I figure this out. All right, first question today is from Kerwin. Two questions from Kerwin. So Kerwin asks, what concept or idea have you had the biggest shift/change in since you started coaching? I had to think about this a little bit. I think the thing that I've probably shifted on the most is video beta. Not that I was doling out video beta to my clients when I started coaching, but I have put video beta on the internet for a really long time, and I still do. I think my oldest videos are 15 years old, probably, on YouTube. So predating a lot of the most popular video beta out there. Not all of it, obviously. I wasn't the first, but I was pretty early to the game. So nowadays, I'm pretty firmly against giving people explicit beta, and I'm kind of against video beta. If you want to maximize learning and progression, I think using video beta is basically a way to send faster at the cost of a little bit of progression speed. Because I think the process of figuring out what to do for yourself is one of the most important things that you can do in order to learn how you climb and how you engage with the challenge. And video beta sort of shortcuts a little bit of that process. And, a shortcut is not necessarily a bad thing, just depends on what you're trying to get out of the journey. The other there's a few, but maybe another big downside of video beta is when it doesn't work for people, and they sort of learn not to go down that path of solving things for themselves. I think people get the wrong impression of what climbing problem solving actually is. There's sort of this round hole, square peg scenario where people will try the beta they saw in the video and it doesn't work, and they sort of just write off the whole problem. And as far as I can tell, that's a pretty new concept in climbing. I really don't remember that happening 10 years ago. I remember people kind of trying problems and being like, wow, this is really hard. I'm not sure what to do. Whereas nowadays, I hear from people all the time that they try the problem and they're like, it's really hard. I couldn't do the moves, or, I couldn't do what I saw in the video, which is a very different way of interacting with the sport. So yeah, it takes away one of the most important parts of the process. I think it takes away one of the most fun parts of the process. Frankly, I think the problem solving is my favorite part of the sport for sure. I really enjoy using video beta to try to flash things as well, but I'm putting that on top of many, many years of building up trying to do things without the video beta in the first place. So I think it makes a little more sense logically that way. And it's just sort of emblematic of this commodification of climbing that you can take a send and put it in your pocket and you've gained something, like a notch in the belt, which I buy into that too. I have a logbook website and I keep track of how many things I've done of certain grades and stuff, kind of out of morbid self-interest. But I don't think that that's really a very healthy thing for us to do. And basically, since I started coaching, I've just, over time, my distaste for it has just grown and grown. So I think that's an area that I have had a really big shift. There's a lot of other ones, obviously, but that was the thing that jumped to mind. So if that's you, if I just described you, keep using video beta, but also embrace the opportunities to try to figure things out for yourself. And if you think a boulder looks cool or you think a route looks cool, route climbing is just great for this in general because there's so much less beta out there. But if you think something looks cool, go through the process of trying to figure it out for yourself. Don't automatically jump to needing to have the solution given to you. And it's going to be frustrating, but you're buying something for that frustration. You're buying progress instead of just trying to get some achievement. Kerwin's second question: what non-climbing book has had the biggest impact on your climbing/coaching and why? So I immediately jumped to one of my favorite books. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow by Danny Kahneman. It's a behavioral economics book or behavioral psychology book. It's kind of infamous in psychology because a lot of the studies that they did for the book have been the studies that have been in the replication crisis in social psychology right now. And if you don't know what that is, basically that means they go back and they try to repeat an old study and they get different results than they got in the old study for one reason or another. And it basically makes it seem like something was wrong with that old study. But some of the studies from Thinking Fast and Slow have borne out. And even if some of them were flawed in the way the studies were put together, the book still made me think twice about trusting my own brain, or the way that I think. And it made me notice my logical biases and my logical fallacies much, much more often, because the book is huge and you just learn so many things about the way the mind works and the things the mind prefers. I read it 10 or 12 years ago, and then I read it again a few years ago. And I just think about this stuff all the time. So I went to the summary, like the chapter or like concept summary for the book, and pulled out a bunch of the core concepts. And I just pulled out things that immediately jumped out to me as things that show up in climbing. So here's just a bunch of examples of why I think this is a legendary book for understanding human logic. So the main idea in the book is this system 1, system 2 thing, which is basically you have your logical processing system that works really hard and super costly. We don't like turning that one on. And then you have your super lazy, make the easiest decision possible, don't turn the brain on, don't use that expensive metabolic process of turning the brain on other system. And I think that's been the least reproducible part of the book, but I find it super interesting and useful. And probably where it shows up the most for me is issues with my skin. Like when I'm in the moment, in the flow, and I'm getting ready for a try on the boulder, and I look at my skin, it's so hard for me to turn that rational process on of being like, I need to step away from this boulder and take care of my fucking skin or I'm going to get a flapper. I just look at my skin and I'm like, I'm so psyched to go for it. And I just go for it and tear my skin up. I just cannot get out of the monkey brain and into the rational thinking brain. So that one shows up a lot. Another concept in the book is loss aversion, which would be like the idea of losing $10 is like more devastating to us than the idea of gaining $10 is pleasant to us. So similar thing in climbing would be if V9 is your working grade, the idea of not sending a V9 is way more damaging than the idea of sending one is pleasing, which should be resonant with a lot of people. It's like if you've done a ton of a certain grade, you expect to send one, and you almost don't even get that much pleasure from it. But if you don't send one, it's devastating. So we're very loss aversive, I think, in climbing. The sunk cost fallacy, a lot of people are familiar with that. So that's like you go to your project over and over and over and over, hoping to send it, even if you're actually not that close. You probably could have gone and sent a ton of other things in that time, but you have already put all this effort in. And so you think that you're close because you've invested a bunch of effort, and maybe you're not even that close. And it's not even worth it at this point. That's the sunk cost fallacy. That's maybe one of the most popular things that the book talks about. The availability heuristic, so that's kind of jumping to the solutions that are most familiar for us. So if you're somebody who really likes to heel hook, you're always going to look for heel hooks first thing when you show up to the boulder. And if there's some other solution, so if there's like you actually do need to like toe in, or you actually need to do a big dyno and the heel hook's kind of a red herring, that heel hook will show up for you first and you'll actually get sucked into doing it even if it's not the best choice. That's the availability heuristic. Another one where that shows up is maybe people thinking that an area is just whatever the most popular problems are in that area. So like when you say Mose Valley, people think like Gripshin and Israel and, Crusaders for Justice and the Swan or whatever, like the things that get the most on like Kaya and Sendage and the things that are on YouTube the most, people are going to be like, oh, those are the best problems in Mose Valley, or those are like the first problems in Mose Valley. But there's just some problems in Mose Valley. There's hundreds and hundreds of problems there. It's just that there's a lot of information on those couple ones that I listed. So people tend to think that those are, the best or the most popular. The halo effect is another thing in the book. People tend to form positive judgments of climbs that are considered classic, even when you consider them objectively. Maybe they're actually kind of low quality. I really think if something has a rule, like if you're not allowed to use the arete or you're not allowed to use this hold, it is objectively a low quality boulder or route. I don't really care if somebody else says it's classic. If there's a hold you can't use, I think that's kind of like, well, it's a slightly less classic route then. That's just how it is. And then the experiencing versus remembering self is another one in the book. Last example. We often remember things differently than the way they actually happened. And we even reconstruct our memories every time we remember something. This has happened to me many, many, many times with climbing. I'll climb something on my first try, and my memory of it was easy because I didn't have to invest very much emotional effort in doing it. But then when I try it again later, I find out actually it was really fucking hard, and I just experienced it once for this short time, and so I sort of assumed that it was easy, but it wasn't. And also with scary things, scary situations, you kind of like reconstruct the memory over time to just remember it as being like fun or high quality or something, when objectively the experience itself was really scary and unpleasant. But the way I remember it is just different. So it's a really interesting book. And if you're a fan of learning about the human brain, I think it's a worthwhile book to read, even if some of the studies haven't been replicated. And there's like some pretty good resources on the internet about which parts of the book have been replicated well and which parts haven't. Okay, next question is from Olga. Olga says, energy systems or not? When I climb 2 grades below my limit, I can climb all day, send all day, and feel great. When I climb at my limit, I only have like 4 ground up attempts before I die. Is there a cure? ? Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know what your definition of die is, but I think this is a pretty normal occurrence. And the reason for that is basically just the closer you go to failure, the more time it's going to take to recover. You can get into the nuances of the energy systems, but there's other things that are going on in climbing besides just the local energy systems. There's also like neural fatigue and psychological fatigue and all that kind of stuff. You know, if you imagine like deadlifting at, you know, doing like your 1 rep max is fatiguing in a very different way than doing like a set of 10 that's a little bit down from your max. They're both really tiring, but they're really tiring in very different ways. And if you spread those sets out over a day, eventually you're just not going to be able to pick that 1 rep max up off the ground. Whereas the 10 rep max, or, you know, 10 rep set, you might not be able to do 10 reps of it, but you're still going to be able to pick it up off the ground and move the weight. And I think it's kind of a similar thing. So as far as getting better at it, a few things. I think definitely spread your attempts over the longest time period you can. I've talked about that before. Because if you know you're only going to have 4 good attempts, I mean, first of all, maybe resting twice as much will get you 5 attempts. Even if you have to warm back up, that's worth it if you're climbing outside. If you're climbing inside or something and you're taking a strategy of minimizing your rest instead of maximizing your performance, then I wouldn't expect to do very well on things that are your limit, because minimizing your rest is really never a good strategy. So spread your attempts over a longer time period. And then as far as the actual energy systems, the aerobic power system would probably be the one that I would look at, which would be like your ability to clear out the previous effort faster and get back up to the ability to have like a really high quality bout. And the way to train that is basically to just do it over and over and over. So you want it to be a little bit more aggressive than like a limit day. So if you have a limit day where you have 4 really good tries, you're not really stressing that aerobic power system, because you're not doing enough like deplete the system, replenish the system, deplete the system, replenish the system. You're not doing that loop enough times. Like 4 is not very many. And it could be that your volume days are just a little bit too spread out or a little bit too easy, and your more efficient systems are doing all the clearance because it's spread over a longer amount of time. So I would say when you do your volume days, you know, a big volume day is really good for your like general aerobic system, your general aerobic fitness. But if you want that aerobic power adaptation, you probably want to do some volume where you actually don't rest as much in between like rips on the boulder. And then, you know, you do a set, and during that set, you're actually going to get pretty tired and pretty pumped, but you're trying to clear it out in between each attempt on the boulder. And then you'll take a long rest and do, you know, maybe 2 or 3 sets in a day. That's a really good session to do on a board. Some people do that as like an every minute on the minute. So like you just set a timer for 60 seconds, you climb on the board for 20 seconds at the start of the timer, and then you do that, 8, 10, 12 times, and then you take like a 6 to 10 minute rest, and you would do that maybe 2-3 times total. And I can, if you want that written down, you can just message me, but I think it probably makes sense. Basically, the idea is to actually get kind of pumped and then put the body under stress to clear that out, and then get kind of pumped again and then put the body under stress again, and just repeat that process. But I mean, in the grand scheme of things, you're talking about increasing the number of tries that you could give on a limit problem from 4 to like 6 or something. If it's, unless it's like a really short problem. If it's even remotely long, then you're just never going to get that many really good tries on it, even if all your systems are super honed. Because if you could have that many good tries on it, it's just by definition not at your limit. Okay, next question is from Jack. Jack says, how can we make use of the concept of MRV as climbers since the sport is so complex? I.e., no easy set to rep schemes to determine capacity or recovery, and so many confounding factors in the measurements like skin, friction, etc. So MRV, for anybody who doesn't know, is maximum recoverable volume, and that's usually in opposition to MED, or minimum effective dose. So maximum recoverable volume is what's the most training or activity that I can get away with. Minimum effective dose is what's the least activity or training that I can do in order to make progress on whatever this thing is. These things in climbing specifically, are really only useful in the abstract. Generally speaking, when we talk about training in general, including things like weightlifting and other sports and stuff, MRV, I think, is largely for elite athletes and people who really want to fly as close to the sun as possible, people who are very risk tolerant. I don't think MRV is super useful for the general population of climbers, even if there was a good way to quantify climbing movement or climbing difficulty, which I don't think there is. I think MED is a way more important concept for the general climber to understand, because even if your goal is to maximize performance, climbing, so much of what we do requires high power, high coordination, low fatigue, especially bouldering. And if you're doing a lot of MRV style training, you're not spending very much of your climbing time in that low fatigue, high power state. So MRV is basically like something you would do for short bouts of training where you're trying to make a big gain, and then you would switch back to performance mode. Maybe that's something that's justifiable. And I do think you see a lot of like World Cup climbers and people doing a lot of MRV style training. I mean, doing like, Aaron McNeese doing like 5 or 6 days a week of like 6 hours plus of training is obviously a very high volume of training. But I think also, to me, when I think about that, I think that just means that those people are capable of even higher peaks if they weren't carrying so much fatigue all the time, which is crazy to think, but that's how strong they actually are, is that they can maintain a much higher level than everyone else, even though they're doing basically way too much volume all the time. They have to do that much volume because they're preparing for competitions and stuff. Anyways, as far as the quantifying climbing piece, 1,000 people have tried to quantify climbing moves in some way that allows you to use ideas like MRV. I'm pretty cynical about it. In addition to skin and friction, which Jack mentioned, you also have your internal effort, which varies. The quality with which you do the moves varies. If you just plotted the course of someone's body, not even their body, let's just say you plot the course of their center of mass throughout a move, and you have them do the same move 20 times, they would never hit the same path, down to like a really, really good climber is probably hitting the same path down to like an inch or a couple inches of their center of mass moving, but certainly not a much lower threshold than that, in my opinion. So it's like, how do you really quantify that? When you have something like a deadlift or a bench press, the weight is objectively moving between the bottom of the rep and the top of the rep. Even if those move around a little bit because the bar path is different, you've still moved the weight away from the planet. And in climbing, you can't even guarantee that you're moving your body mass away from the planet, because we have traverse moves and down climbing moves and stuff. So there's just an insane number of factors that would need to be included in order to make that make sense for climbing. I still think it's useful for thinking about our training though. And the main way that I would use that for most climbers, if performance is important to you and you're not deep in a training phase, unless you're super risk tolerant person and you just really want to fly close to the sun, I would urge you to understand the idea of minimum effective dose in your training and think, what's the least that I can put in here? Maybe this goes back to like a Pareto's principle thing where like you put in 20% of the effort and you get 80% of the gains. That's kind of what you're looking for. That's where the real meat is. MRV, I think, is probably not the move for the majority of people. All right, Luke asks, interested in what extent the language we use impacts performance. Is there a difference between internal and external dialogue when it comes to expectations/progress/success? How does reframing our use of descriptions affect our performance on a project? Is there a safety element involved with language when it comes to highballing, no-fall, sketchy alpine climbing, etc.? A lot of questions in there, and a good question, I think. I'm really interested in self-talk and its effect on our performance. It's something that I talk about a lot, and it seems to be a pretty personal thing, but there is a pretty good body of research in terms of dialogue and its effect on performance, especially in like the education realm. So just some general suggestions. I think there's less of a difference between internal and external dialogue, at least in the research, but there is a good difference in terms of keeping the self-talk more effort-based rather than making it ability-based. So in climbing, that would be like, I'm going to try hard to hold this hold, would be more useful than just like telling yourself that you're good at crimping. Like maybe constructing your self-talk in a way that's more oriented around what your ambition is or what your aim is, rather than a static fact about yourself or something like that. So just calling yourself, like I'm strong, like that might qualify as positive affirmation. But I'm not sure it's the best in terms of self-talk at the boulder. And I think, positive self-talk probably in terms of, affirmations not done at the boulder would probably be better when it is less specific. So I would keep the specificity for when you're trying to perform and be general when you're not, if that makes sense. Personally, I think as far as this stuff goes, if you're thinking about like what's going on before you're getting ready to try your project, I think visualization and what you do in your visualization is probably a more useful thing to focus on than the talking, because I've known and seen plenty of climbers who have all kinds of different habits in terms of dialogue with people when they're getting ready to climb. But I think visualization is it's not universal, but it's very, very widely understood by climbers to be super effective way to get yourself to have a positive experience on the boulder or on the route or whatever it is. One other thing I'll say is like while you're actually climbing, if the climbing is like a low enough complexity or low enough coordination demand that you have bandwidth for other things, I do think there seems to be something to the idea of like singing or humming or whistling while you climb. And I know that I did a lot of that when I was like on-siting routes kind of in my early days. And in retrospect, I was just really scared. And the singing or humming or whistling was like some kind of manifestation of that fear. But it also kind of let me stay in flow. And that's interesting. It definitely wouldn't work on difficult climbing, but on consequential easy climbing seemed to be a pretty effective strategy for me. I kind of wonder if anybody has tried to use that as like a teaching strategy for people who are trying to get into climbing. I'm not sure. As far as the last piece of this question, is there a safety element involved with language when it comes to highballing / no fall / sketchy alpine climbing? My advice there would be, to answer the question, yes, there's definitely a safety element with language. So with any kind of consequential climbing where both people are involved in the climbing, you need to communicate clearly and concisely. I mean, anybody who's ever done a multi-pitch knows how important that is, especially when your communication gets stretched over, 100 feet or more and you're kind of yelling. You need to choose really clear syllables that can't sound like other things. There's a lot on the line, obviously. as far as bouldering or trad climbing, or like things where there's one person climbing and then other people who are just kind of around, I would say there's still a really big safety element here. And I see people mess this up all the time. I would say the most important thing is don't impute or project your emotions onto the climber, which I know is like, if you're a spotter or belayer, it can be really stressful watching the climber do something and you want to engage with them somehow. But I think if the spotter's scared and they're saying things to the climber that are sort of communicating that they're scared about the situation, that doesn't really do anybody any favors. So if you're not sure, just be quiet, probably is the best choice. I mean, I can't count the number of times I've seen a climber kind of sketching out and the spotters are like, are you okay? You got this? Are you doing good? Is that a jug? And it's like, that's just not a very useful thing to be projecting onto the climber when they're trying to do something difficult. And a related thing to that would be, don't lie to the climber. So like, if somebody's, up on something sketchy and the pad is like marginally underneath them, don't tell them that they're good. Don't be like, you're totally safe. Only say that if it's 100% true. I feel like that should be obvious, but I've seen the opposite enough times to know that people maybe don't think that kind of thing through completely. Like, if the climber's not good to fall, don't tell them that they're safe to fall. That obviously could go really badly. All right, next question. Another question from Olga. Olga says, how to handle the situation where I'm so close to sending, but I'm really not enjoying this climb anymore and everything about it frustrates me. Don't say walk away because I'm so close to sending. Smiley face. The values here are at odds with each other. And what I mean by that is, you can want to send at any cost. That can be your highest value. Or you can want to enjoy your day out of climbing. That could be your highest value. But as you've realized from this question, it's very hard to have both of those things be your priority at the same time. So it's kind of just a logical fallacy to expect to send something that's really challenging for you and also for it to be super fun. I think you can take your sessions kind of low key and like get a little bit of like a min-max where it's minimally frustrating because you're not putting as much pressure on yourself and you maybe only lose a percentage point or two of your performance, because the pressure can be helpful, I think, sometimes. But you have to be clear with yourself about your values in general. You have to know which thing is important to you. Like, are you in climbing to have fun days out, or are you in climbing to send stuff? Which to me goes back to that commodification thing I talked about earlier, which I think is a little bit suspect. And those goals may vary from session to session, but I think having the conversation with yourself about your values in general is super important. And I think having the conversation with yourself each day is also super important. Like, if you are hiking in and you're like, today I'm going to get this thing done. My job today is to try to send this boulder that I really want to send. That's okay to be performance focused. I'm totally a fan of that. I don't want people to think that I'm not, when I'm like kind of harping on people projecting too much and stuff. I think that's really important, and I do a lot of that stuff myself. But if you tell yourself that the goal today is to send and you're okay with sacrificing other things, if that's the priority, is to try to send, don't be surprised when you're frustrated and you're not having fun. That's what you signed up for. And if you're hiking in and you're like, I just want to have a fun day out today, well, that's fine. Just understand that if you go to your project, it might wind up not being as fun as you thought it would be, right? So I think that's the issue, the core issue here. There's no tactic that's going to solve a values problem, because a values problem is a very core problem. Okay, next question. This is from Jeffrey Wong. He has two questions. Any tips on switching to RPE for lifting? I understand the concept of it, but I find it hard to subjectively assign a number. I generally lift by myself, so don't want to max out a lift to see what a 10 feels like, but unsure how else to approach this. Okay, so first things first, RPE, that's rate of perceived exertion for anybody who doesn't know. Basically, it's a 1 out of 10 of how hard a set felt or how hard a session felt. Can also be used for session. We usually call that session RPE, just to be clear. RPE for a single set, it's important to understand it is fully subjective. So you may find it hard to be subjective, But the best way to get better at that is to just keep subjectively assigning RPEs to your sets, and it'll make more sense as you go. When we audit RPE, or when we use RPE to judge how hard something is, unlike with traditional percentage-based progression in lifting, where you would do a 1 rep max test every once in a while to set your percentages for the subsequent training phase, with RPE, we would actually audit it the other way around. So what you would do, Jeffrey, is like you would take a deadlift or a bench set where you did some amount of weight for some number of reps, and you said this felt like RPE 8. So I'll just pick some round numbers to make it easy. Let's say you deadlifted 200 pounds for 6 reps, and you thought that was RPE 8. Usually with RPE, it's important to understand 10 minus the RPE, so the remainder there, which would be 2 if it was RPE 8. That should be roughly how many reps you have in the tank. That's some useful feedback we can use to get better at this subjectivity. So if you thought 200 pounds for 6 was RPE 8, then you should be able to do 200 pounds for 8 reps for those 2 reps in the tank, which we can test, right? You can put 200 pounds on the bar and lift it as many times as you can. And it's way more comfortable to fail by lifting a lighter weight many times than it is to fail by trying to lift as much weight as you can, right? The really, really important thing with RPE to understand is like, we're not trying to use it we don't need to know what a 10 is, right? And you're probably never going to hit a 10 in training anyway. Something has probably gone wrong if you're hitting a 10 in training. That's performance. The high value of RPE is what is an 8 on any given day is going to be different. That's the value of that subjectivity. If you even just think about it this way, if you deadlift, bench, and squat, let's say you do 3 working sets of bench, and then 3 working sets of squat, and then you do your deadlifts at the end. Well, your RPE on that deadlift session might be different than if you come straight into the gym and do your deadlifts first. So with a traditional percentage-based loading methodology, that deadlift session, if the deadlifts were at the very beginning of the session, 70% of the weight might be 70% of the weight. But if the deadlifts are at the end of the session, 70% of your 1 rep max might actually be like 80% of what you can do at that time. But it's still, in both cases, going to be the same RPE. Or sorry, if you were using RPE, you could still, in each case, make it RPE whatever. You would just adjust the weight down if the deadlifts were at the end of the session. So it just gives you room to negotiate with your training that you don't really have in a percentage-based progression methodology. And I really encourage you to go find the Barbell Medicine blogs on RPE. So you can just Google Barbell Medicine RPE and you'll find them. They're really valuable. I think it's like a 2-part blog, and there are also some YouTube videos that are linked from there. I think from the guy that does Untamed Strength. I can't remember his name, but really good videos and blogs for understanding RPE and how to get started with it. It took me a little bit to understand how to use it for sure, but just keep going with it. It'll make sense. And I think it's just really important to remember, RPE may seem subjective, but weight is also subjective. Humans evolved all of this muscle physiology and ability to gain muscle and gain better muscle recruitment and everything. All that stuff came through evolution without any knowledge of how much things weighed or anything like that. So that's all totally secondary. You can totally get stronger, just challenging yourself day in, day out. Okay, second question. One of the main reasons I lift is for health and general body resiliency. I find it also helps with less injuries and feeling better on the wall. With that in mind, are there benchmarks in lifting where we don't need to keep lifting heavier and can focus efforts elsewhere for climbing? I've seen bodyweight bench, 1.5 bodyweight squat, and 2 bodyweight deadlift. Is there any validity to this, or should we keep lifting heavier and maintain RPE 7 to 9-ish? Well, first of all, there are no accepted strength standards for rock climbing in any sense. And even, rough guidelines like these ones here are going to vary pretty dramatically from climber to climber. Obviously, male and female are going to have different abilities to hit these benchmarks easily based on genetics. And then also, if you have particularly short arms and a barrel chest, bodyweight bench is going to be easier than if you have poor muscular leverage, super long arms, things like that. So I would be careful with generalities. I think, probably some huge percentage of the benefits of strength training are achieved simply by doing the strength training consistently for a long time. So you can challenge yourself from a muscular recruitment sense and a maintenance sense for a long time without necessarily going up in weight. I think you eventually want to do things like slightly change the programming so you don't go crazy. So you might want to do like a deficit deadlift or a deficit RDL, or do some rack pulls and like go super heavy, or do some Zercher deadlifts. You might want to like change things up a little bit just to keep it interesting. And then when you rotate back to your deadlifts, maybe it's gone up a little bit because you've gotten stronger. Maybe it hasn't. Doesn't really matter that much. And again, if your primary goal is to get better at climbing, to kind of go back to the RPE thing a little bit, it doesn't really matter if you put 200 pounds on the bar or 195 pounds on the bar or 205 pounds on the bar. It's just there to keep you generally strong and healthy so that you can do good climbing practice. And that's the piece to focus on. So as far as these arbitrary benchmarks, I think they're cool to chase. And if that helps you get motivated for your off season to do more strength training, and you think that that's like useful for you as a person, because health and general body resiliency, like you said, then chase those benchmarks. And it's totally possible to like try a little harder and get a little better at a lift, or even put on a little bit of muscle that might not be climbing specific and hit some benchmark, and then just drop off on your volume for that lift, and you'll detrain appropriately, and in many cases you'll lose some of that muscle. So it's I think it's just not that big of a deal in general. But if you're doing it, you're getting most of what you need from it. That's what matters. Okay, next question. This question was from Cursed Climbing on Instagram. They asked, what has been your in the moment most awe-inspiring climbing experience? A lot of different definitions of awe-inspiring. I think the thing that jumped to mind, which is kind of funny, was I saw Paul Robinson trying lucid dreaming before he did the first ascent. And it's funny that this jumped to mind because it was extremely not awe-inspiring, but it was one of the first memories I have of climbing where I realized that harder and harder and harder and harder climbing might not actually be that fun. Because there was a big group of us watching him, and it seemed like a ton of pressure. And he wasn't really able to try very much. He had to rest a ton, and he was mostly just messing with his skin. And in the whole time, that whole session, or I only watched him for, 30 minutes or something, but that whole time he tried it maybe like twice. And both times he just kind of popped off, and, they're not really very pleasant holds to fall off of like that. And I remember kind of walking away from it just being like, that's not as cool as I thought it was from seeing hard climbing in all the videos. Not very awe-inspiring. If you mean me personally, I would go with some of my memories from climbing in South Africa. Just, it's not my favorite place to climb, but the landscape and the sunsets and the experiences I had with my friends were extremely memorable, and definitely I was full of awe at many points during that trip. And if you mean maybe more just traditional, like seeing somebody do something cool, two that spring to mind, 2 times I've been with really high performers are, I climbed with Jimmy Webb quite a long time ago, and he basically climbed the whole Northwest in a day. I don't remember everything that he did, but just a insanely talented climber. I hate that word talent, but insanely skilled climber, I suppose. Really wild to see him do his thing. And then I also had a day climbing with Drew Ruana in Squamish, where Drew did all of the top 100 V11s in a day without really breaking a sweat. And that was pretty impressive. All right, that is all the questions for this month. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for tuning in. And I'll be back in March for another round. I'm going to index all of these and set up a page where you can look at all the questions that have been asked and get kind of linked to the time in each episode. So hopefully it'll become like a useful resource. But I'm also looking forward to doing some normal podcast episodes as we get going. This is kind of just my way to dip my toe in the water. So I appreciate everyone's support. Thanks for listening. And if you have any feedback, feel free to hit me up. You know where I am. Thanks, everybody.